Music 292, Week 7, Part 1, Meter and Accent. As musicians, we tend to learn meter intuitively rather than explicitly. In other words, we tend to learn it through experience rather than through music theory. We have a good intuitive understanding of concepts such as beat, meter, and rhythm, but when we're asked to define these concepts, we actually struggle quite a bit. For example, we intuitively know the answer to questions like, what is the time signature of this piece? But if we're asked to explain why this is the case to others, we often can't do so. For example, if I asked you these questions, would you be able to explain the answer? What's the difference between 3/4 and 6/8? How about between 4/4 and 2/2? The grouping structure is different, but I'm not sure that we're necessarily consciously aware of that. Why might we notate something in 4/4 rather than 4/8? These two rhythms will sound exactly the same after all. In this case, the fundamental unit of measurement is different, which might relate to the tempo. There might be some effect depending how fast or slow the piece is going. If you don't have bar lines, how do you figure out the meter? We tend to assume there, quote, is no meter in these situations, but that's not actually true. The meter just isn't notated in these situations. This unit aims to make meter and rhythm concepts more explicit to you so that you can apply them to more complex situations. Let's get started. Let's start with some vocabulary around rhythm and meter, some terms that we use intuitively but that we don't necessarily have an exact definition pinned down for. Pulse is a series of durations that are perceived as equal. Pulse is established by a repeated pattern of accents. So pulse is basically what you hear as that regular beat. And we hear that as a regular beat because there's some sort of accentuation happening. So because of that, we're going to talk about accent more specifically in this video. Meter is the grouping of a faster beat or pulse by a slower synchronized beat or pulse. Meter is established by the coordination of several different pulses. So we can actually have different levels of beat happening at the same time, or different levels of pulse. Note that I'm using those two terms interchangeably, beat and pulse. For example, if we're thinking of something like 6/8, we've got the eighth note pulse going on. But you'll notice I accentuated those eighth notes in a particular way. Essentially, every third one got a stronger emphasis than the other ones. And that's because there's a larger beat that's happening on top of that. Ta, ta. So that thing I'm tawing is the slower speed pulse in that meter. So because we have these multiple coexisting pulses or beats, we can determine meter without having a time signature by examining how these things coordinate. We're used to thinking of time signature in terms of thinking that as a visual concept. So let me just review what you probably know already from rudiments. In a time signature, the top number indicates the number of beats that we have in each bar. The bottom number of your time signature indicates the value of the beat. So if it's an 8, it means it's an eighth note beat. If it's a 4, it's a quarter note beat, and so forth. I do want to emphasize here that you should remember that different values can be used for the bottom number of the time signature. We're not just limited to 4 and 8. Things like 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and basically any power of 2 can occur as that bottom number. It tends to be that the eighth note and quarter note are the more common time signatures, but there's a wealth of other possibilities that are used in various time periods and various styles of notation. Let's review some of the basics about meter that you probably know from rudiments. You probably encountered the terms duple, triple, and quadruple in your rudiment study of rhythm. Duple talks about a meter that has 2 beats, triple talks about a meter that has 3 beats, and quadruple talks about a meter that has 4 beats. I've got a few examples there on the right-hand side. Notice that in each case, I'm showing an example that has the quarter note as the beat, but I'm also showing an example that has the dotted quarter note as the beat. Because that's another fundamental difference that we're going to talk about. We'll get to that in just a sec. Within each of these duple, triple, or quadruple meters, we have a certain set organization of strong beats versus weak beats. And I'm also going to use medium beat for something that's halfway in the middle. So you can see in duple, for example, the downbeat gets a strong beat, the second beat gets the weaker beat. We see in triple, the downbeat gets the strong beat, and then beats 2 and 3 are weaker. And we see in quadruple that we get a strong, weak, medium, weak pattern. And these are going to be very, very consistent in Western music. We also have a differentiation between what's called simple meter and what's called compound meter. In simple meter, each beat divides into 2, whereas in compound meter, each beat divides into 3. So in my top example for duple meter, 2/4, the subdivision of the note would typically be into eighth notes. Then if we subdivided it again into 16th notes and so forth. In 6/8, if we take that dotted quarter note, we actually would also subdivide that into eighth notes. But in this case, we can fit 3 of those in the space of our bigger level pulse. So if we're talking about how our pulses coordinate, in a simple meter, you're going to have a pulse that's in groupings of 2 with a bigger level pulse. And in compound meter, you're going to have an underlying pulse of 3 that groups with a larger level pulse. Keep in mind as well, I don't have them notated on the diagram here, but offbeat divisions are going to be weaker than onbeat divisions. So the subdivisions I was just talking about will be 1 level weaker than the accents I'm already showing on the diagram. We also have this category called hybrid meter, and hybrid meter means that it's mixing subdivisions of 2 and subdivisions of 3. So your beats in this kind of meter end up being different sizes. So if we look at 11/8, for example, you can see that the grouping that I've shown on the page has a grouping of 2, followed by a grouping of 3, a grouping of 3, and a grouping of 3 eighth notes. It still counts in this case as a quadruple meter because the larger level pulse has 4 things, but the way that we subdivide those is different. So that's going to sound uneven. So knowing all this, we can start to answer the question of how do we determine meter? We've mostly been taught how to determine meter by looking at bar lines, note values, and number of beats, and essentially doing the math to figure it out. However, in non-notated music, we actually don't have that information. So if you're doing something by listening to it, you don't have it on the page. You don't necessarily know what it looks like. I'd like to play you an example before I put up the notation. And here's what it looks like with the notation. It turns out that accents in the music can help us determine pulse and meter. And when I say accent, I'm not just talking about those things that are the written out accents, but I'm talking about accent that can be created through other elements of music as well. We're going to talk about accent generally as a type of musical accentuation. These accents will be generated by significant contrast or change. And accents will reinforce the meter in Western music. That is, they most often line up with the stronger beats of the meter. Note that this won't always happen and it will vary a little bit by style. But when accents don't align with the meter, we actually notice this as unusual. And that's why syncopations feel more prominent in the music than regular onbeat rhythms. So it's really those offbeat things are going to be a moment to notice rather than something that feels like it's regular. I'm going to talk about 7 different kinds of accent in this class. Durational, registral, leap, beginning, repetition, dynamic, and articulation. And I'm guessing you probably haven't heard these terms before, so let me take a quick minute to define these and then put them in context with the example that I played for you. A durational accent is a long note that occurs after a shorter note. So if we take a look at our example below, we can see that I put a D to represent that durational accent on top of the note A. And I'm doing that because this is a longer value than the thing that just came before it. Because this is a longer note, it's going to feel like we're pausing on it for a moment, or it has a little bit more weight. And because of that, we're going to feel that almost as a type of accent. So let's take a minute, let's go mark in the other durational accents in this example. What I want you to do is anytime you have a note that is longer than the previous note, put a D on top of it to indicate durational accent. Ready? This is what it looks like. Durational accent can be really useful to figure out because these durational accents often line up with the strong beats of the meter. They're very often on beat 1, for example, or in like a 4/4, for example, might be on your beat 3, your so-called medium beat. And so you can see in my example that those durational accents are spaced somewhat regularly compared to one another. My first 2, for example, are 2 quarter notes apart. My second 2 are 4 quarter notes apart. And then I get some of those measurements actually recurring in the second half of my example. So that's suggesting to us that this is some kind of meter that's grouped in 2 quarter notes or in 4 quarter notes. So this gives us some hint about what maybe the time signature might be in this case. We're going to come back to that. The next kind of accent I want to talk about is registral accent. Registral accent occurs in the highest or lowest note of a passage. And so a passage can be a phrase, it can be an entire piece. We can have registral accents happening at different levels compared to one another. So in this particular case, if you take a look at our melody, you'll notice that G above the staff is actually our highest pitch. And because of that, it's going to get some accentuation. We're going to really notice that note. But to a certain extent, we're actually going to notice the lowest note as well. And so I've marked in both on the figure. It will tend to be that in higher register pieces, you'll notice the higher note is having this registral accent. And in lower register pieces, for example, maybe something in the bass clef, you'll notice the lower note is having the registral accent. But both occur. And when I'm asking you to mark this in, I'm going to ask you to mark both the high one and the low one. Next, leap accent occurs when a note is approached by leap, thus the name. The larger the leap, the stronger the accent's going to be. So something like a leap of a third, we're going to barely hear any leap accent, but something like a leap of an octave, we're going to hear a very significant leap accent. And that leap accent goes on the arrival note of that leap. So in our figure, for example, we see that A, which is the fourth note of the piece, it's a leap of a fifth to get to that thing. So we're going to hear that as pretty significant, that shift of register. We have a couple other leaps in the passage that I've indicated. The C to F is a leap of a fourth. The G to D is also a leap of a fourth. And then when we get that same leap of a fifth repeated to land on the A. Thirds are technically leap accents, but since it is the smallest possible size of leap, we're not going to hear them particularly strongly as accents. So in that case, probably your best bet is to just indicate them in brackets to show that they're there, but they're not really that strong. There's some cases, which we'll probably discuss when we start getting to some of the perusal work, where it might be more important than in other cases to show these. Next, beginning accent occurs when a note happens after a substantial silence. So thus the name, probably the beginning note is where we're going to hear beginning. But to be honest, we can actually also hear this after there's been a longer rest. So maybe partway through the piece, you've got a rest and then a melody comes back in. That would get beginning accent. Next, repetition accent occurs when there's a duplication of previous content, most commonly as rhythm or pitch. So in my particular example, you can see that there's a repeating rhythm that happens in the music. We get a da, 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 da. Or if we want to essentialize that down to its rhythm, ta, 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 ta. That thing repeats starting on the G that we get a few beats later. Exactly the same rhythm again. But it turns out that there's other rhythmic similarities in this piece as well. We have this shorter pattern that's the da, 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 that's embedded inside of the bigger pattern that we're talking about. And so I've indicated that underneath the score. We're going to come back in a few minutes to how that's going to be relevant to you for finding meter. But what I can say right now is that repetition segments are often the length of the bar. So this can give you a hint of maybe what your time signature is, of what your total bar length is going to be. Next, dynamic accent occurs when there's a significant change in dynamic level. So for example, the double forte that we see in the middle of this example, it's going to get a dynamic accent because it's a significant change. I do want to point out that significant change doesn't necessarily mean louder, although a lot of the times it is louder. If you have a significant change to quiet, that's also going to be a really noticeable moment, and that will also create accent. And then lastly, articulation accent is what we tend to think of as the traditional accent type. It's a change in the articulation of the note. So these are most often notated with one of your articulation symbols. Your shape accent is an example of one of those. But they can occur as sforzando accents, for example, tenutos. In some cases, staccato if it's a significant contrast with what else we're hearing in the piece. And so in this particular case, we've got two instances of the notated accent. All right, so there's a lot of information on the score. Let me clean up the slide a little bit and we'll talk about how this information is actually useful to us. What does this tell us about the music? Well, areas with multiple accents often correspond to strong beats in the music. This helps us to find the downbeat of the bar. So if we take a look at our score and what we've marked up so far, you can see there's a couple of locations have multiple accent types. Here, for example, in the middle of the piece, we can see that this G is a small leap accent, but it is the registral accent. It's a dynamics accent because it's double forte, and it starts a repetition. And so because of that, it's going to get some repetition accent. So because this is multiple kinds of accent, this tells us this particular note is really, really strong. There's a very good chance in this case that this is going to be a downbeat of a bar. There's two other locations that have multiple accent types. Take a minute to find those, and then we'll take it up together. All right, so you probably noticed these two locations. In both cases, we have a leap accent to the A, it has a durational accent, it has a registral accent as the lowest note of the piece, and it's got an articulation accent in the first case. And so once again, because there's layers of different accent happening here, we're going to hear this as very strong, and probably this is going to be beat one of a bar. So I'm going to put in some bar lines there to help me out. This will give me some hints on how to figure out my time signature. All of a sudden, it's starting to look like this might be in 4/4 with 4 quarter notes to the bar. And we can particularly see that in that middle region of the piece. With the G, D, and then E, we've got a huge amount of accent on the G and then not so much going on the next 2 quarter notes. And so then we can ask ourselves, well, would it make sense to divide the rest of this up in 4/4, 4 quarter notes per bar? So I'm going to do that. And then once I do that, I notice that, well, it turns out a lot of bars have accent on my beat 1. Happens in bar 2, bar 3, bar 4, bar 5, not so much in bar 6, but in bar 7 and bar 8 for sure happens. I also notice there's a lot of durational accent on what would be my beat 3. And that tells me that, yeah, this thing is probably 4/4 rather than another division like 2/2. So let's answer the question, how do we decide on the bottom number of our key signature? Well, the durational accents, like I said, are one aspect of that, but we can also look for the middle ground duration. What do I mean by that? Well, this piece has eighth notes, quarter notes, and half notes, with one whole note at the very ending. If I'm thinking to myself, well, what's the average of these notes? Probably it's going to be the quarter note. And so because of that, it's the most likely time value for our pulse or for our measurement. And as a result, we're probably going to want to use that as the bottom number of our time signature. Since the quarter is that middle ground duration, there's 4 of them grouped in the bar based on where our durational and other accent types went. This piece is in 4/4. These same features can help us to find anacrucies. Anacrucies, by the way, is just the fancy music theory term for pickup note. I've got 3 rhythm examples here because I kind of want to filter out some of the additional information about leap and register and all that. And I want to focus more on duration and repetition. Take a minute to try to add durational accents to the first example. Don't forget, durational accent means a longer note after a shorter note. This is what it should look like. And once again, you'll notice those durational accents are spaced out pretty evenly. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Next, I want you to look for repetition in this rhythm. So take a minute and see, well, are there any patterns that repeat, and then mark them on your score. You may have noticed repetition at one of 2 different levels. You might have noticed a bigger pattern that essentially takes up half of the example, that then gets repeated in the second half of the example. Or you might have noticed a shorter pattern, and you may have aligned it somewhat differently, just depending where you saw it starting. But essentially the 2 eighth notes followed by a quarter, or you can think of it the other way around if you want to start it on the second beat, quarter, 2 eighth notes. This is giving us some very particular information. So the shorter way of grouping this thing is probably a bar level repetition. Although it's not necessarily going to align with the beat 1, that could maybe shift around a little bit. The bigger grouping is probably our phrase level repetition. In other words, this thing's probably 2 phrases. So these 2 pieces of information, durational accent and repetition, tell us something about this rhythm. The bar is either 2 quarter notes or 4 eighth notes long, because that's the spacing between most of our durational accents. Durational accents are spaced out according to the same length for the most part, so this confirms this length of the bar that I just mentioned. But what's interesting though is this also helps us to figure out pickup. You notice that your durational accent falls on the second quarter note of our bar, and then is spaced regularly after that point. Your downbeat is going to be based on this durational accent placement, so because of this, there's likely a pickup note or an anacrusis. So in this particular case, we probably hear the first two eighth notes as pickup to the quarter note, which is the downbeat of the bar, looking something like this. So this gives us information on how to perform this thing as well. This piece is likely going to be in 2/4 or 4/8, and the way that we're going to make the decision between that is to ask ourselves, well, what's our middle ground duration? And in this case, it turns out there's actually not a right or wrong answer. We only have two duration types in this piece, eighth note and quarter note, so there isn't really a middle ground. We could choose one or the other. We are probably going to perform it slightly differently, though, depending on which of those time signatures we choose. If we choose 2/4, we're going to have a strong beat 1, and then the rest of the bar is going to be weak. If we choose 4/8, we're going to have a strong beat 1, another eighth note, a medium beat, and then another eighth note that's weaker. We also might decide to slow down the tempo if we were in 4/8 in order to fit in this accent accentuation. Here's what they sound like. So in 2/4, ta 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 ta. And in 4/8, ta 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 ta. So different effect depending how we understand the meter here. Try the next two for yourself. I'm going to get you to pause the video, try to sketch in your durational accents, and then map out any repetition and see what you think that tells you about your choice of time signature and about your choice of where the bar lines go. All right, example 2 should look something along the lines of this when you map out your durational accents and your repetition. And so you probably notice two different lengths of repetition. In the first half of the example, it seems to be a repetition that's 6 eighth notes long. In the second half of the example, it seems to be a repetition that's 3 eighth notes long. So truthfully, this thing could be 6/8 or it could be 3/8. I would actually argue for 6/8 because the first thing we're going to hear is going to establish our sense of normalcy for any example of music. And so because our first thing is the 6 eighth note long, that probably makes more sense for our time signature. I can also look at my middle ground duration, and I see in this particular example that there's some 16ths, some eighth notes, and some quarter notes, and then some dotted notes, which we're generally going to focus on the non-dotted notes to make that calculation. So in this particular case, the middle of those values would be the eighth note. So that's probably the bottom number of our time signature. The fact we have these longer 6 eighth note long repetition patterns, though, really is weighting us towards 6/8, even though we do break those down into smaller components. We do have this weight halfway through the bar, which does lend an element of ambiguity, but I think there's enough repetition here to really help to establish our grouping of 6. All right, let's take a look at the third example. So when we place our durational accents, we can see that they're spaced pretty regularly compared to one another. We can see that they seem to be separated out by about 3 quarter notes. We also see that in terms of the total types of durations that we have here, we have eighth notes, we have quarter notes, and we have half notes. So that's suggesting that quarter note is our in-between duration, our medial duration. So that means it's probably something 4. The fact that our durational accents are spaced 3 quarter notes apart is suggesting this is 3/4. And if we map out our repetition, that turns out to map out almost exactly the same way. So we've got these repeating patterns that are 3 quarter notes long, which I bracketed with the red marks. The thing that's a little bit confusing in example 3 is where exactly to start the bar, because you'll notice that those durational accents that we have are happening after the first quarter note of the very start of the piece. And that's suggesting that there's going to be a pickup or an anacrusis of some kind here. That rather than hearing that first quarter note as our beat 1, we're actually going to hear that half note as our beat 1. The regular spacing of the durational accents afterward is suggesting that those durational accents are the beat 1s of each bar. So the bar lines will look something like this. This is pretty consistent with what we expect for meter. In 3/4, we expect a strong beat 1, and then weaker beats 2 and 3. It's okay that my repetition patterns don't line up with the bar. Those repetition patterns are going to show you the length of the bar, but they're not necessarily going to be lined up with beat 1. They could be aligned with a pickup note, for example. It's really common when we're dealing with segments that if there's an initial pickup for the first segment, that later segments are also going to involve a pickup of some kind. And that's true of phrasing as well when we're looking larger scale. So that's an overview of how to apply these concepts to figure out meter. We're going to take those meter concepts and we're also going to pair them with our other accent concepts in our perusal analysis for this week. So you're going to take a look at the example that I've got on screen, and you're going to answer a bunch of questions around indicating accent throughout this piece. I'm going to take a slightly different approach in this, in that I'm going to ask you to not listen to this thing beforehand, because it turns out this thing is actually a pretty famous tune. What I would like you to do is get a sense of how to use these theory concepts to help you figure out things like bar lines, meter, repetition, phrasing, and sections. And I want you to do it manually rather than just using your musical intuition. That's it for your video on segmentation and accent. I hope that this is some new vocabulary and some new concepts for you. And as I said, in our online discussions, we're gonna get some practice in actually using those. See you in the next video.